Hello, and welcome to today's Random Review. Thank you for being here. My name is Charles. I'm a librarian. First, some acknowledgements and thank yous. The Random Review Committee is a group of 9 volunteers who come together once a year to select the books and reviewers for this 10-month series. It's a great deal of work. One member, Gary Whitehouse, also writes our press releases. This program is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Library organization. The Friends founded Random Review for 30 years they ran it single-handedly. They also provide support to the library in many ways, including some ambitiously large book sales. You can learn more about how to join the Friends or volunteer with them at their website, which is friendsofthecbclibrary.org. On the topic of websites, to get the most out of Random Review, consider visiting our Random Review webpage via a button on the library homepage. There you will find the Random Review schedule. Hearing kind of an echo, and I hope that's. Yeah, someone had mentioned that last time, and we can turn the volume up too. Just a moment.
That'd be good.
Let's try that. Is it louder for now? Okay, we can tweak it as we go. On that webpage, you can find the Random Review schedule of events, a list of books related to each of the review books. I put 3 back there. Please take them home with you. And that list is compiled by one of our volunteers, Gail Gerdeman, and also links to the video recordings of the events if you happen to have missed one. This year, we're streaming all the Random Review events live, so if you also have the option to participate from home. Today's selection is What's Cooking in the Kremlin by Witold Subtowski, presented by Sarah Henderson. Sarah was born and raised in South Carolina before continuously moving westward for later eras in her life. She completed her undergraduate degree at Oberlin College in Ohio and her PhD at the University of Colorado, Boulder, before moving to Corvallis, Oregon for her first and only academic job at Oregon State University. At OSU, Sarah teaches political science classes, including Russian politics, democracy and autocracy, developing nations, and international development policy. Her research often revolves around questions related to Russian politics, as well as the topic of gender and politics globally. Sarah became interested in all things Russian when, as a senior in high school, she moved to East Berlin for a semester with her parents, who were working on a research grant centered in then East Germany. Sarah crossed the Berlin Wall daily to attend high school in West Berlin and started talking Russian in college to learn more, first about the Cold War, and then, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, the challenges post-Soviet nations faced in transitioning to market economies and democratic states. She first visited the Soviet Union, specifically the Ukrainian Republic, as a small child in the 1970s and visited Russia for the first time in 1992 on a study abroad program, and has since been on research trips that have taken her from the Arctic Circle to the Caucasus and the Russian Far East. She lives in Corvallis with her husband, Doug, whom she met on her 1992 study abroad program, her 18-year-old son, Peter, named in honor of the fact his parents met in Petersburg, and 15-year-old daughter, Vivian. Sarah loves to travel and take her kids to new places. Please welcome Sarah Henderson.
Thank you. Now, before I start, I think we're going to do some work here on the audio. So first, I'm going to take this out. What is your ability? Thank you for that lovely introduction, by the way. How are people feeling about this volume? Is that better? Do people want to crank it up some more?
No, that's good. It's good.
Okay, we're good?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, all right, good. We'll try this. And I'm just going to hold this because I'm not super adept at, I was really impressed with your crouch over the microphone stand. I know how hard that is to maintain. So first of all, thank all of you for coming, and thank you to the committee for having me. I always love these talks because normally I talk to my mostly 18 to 22-year-olds on OSU campus and some graduate students, but it's always a pleasure and one of my favorite parts of the job to talk to members of the community and all the wealth that they bring with their own knowledge. So for me, it's also a great opportunity. And also, it's really nice to be here because the last time I gave a random review, it was on Zoom. So I also very much appreciate and want to celebrate being here in person. So when they reached out to me to review this book, What's Cooking at the Kremlin, I actually already had it on my Kindle. But as so often happens for no particular reason, I had started it and then it had just kind of fallen off my attention span. So getting to review this book allowed me to go through it much more thoroughly. So I'm really glad to talk about this. So what do we want to do in this hour? And by the way, I'm happy to stay later. Of course, if people need to leave at 1, that's fine. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stay behind. So today, I think what we want to talk about in no particular order is certainly what's cooking in the Kremlin. Let's see if I can read the subtitle, actually. From Rasputin to Putin, How Russia Built an Empire with a Knife and Fork. By Polish journalist Witold Zabłocki. So I'm going to try to avoid saying his name because I don't speak Polish. So I had to listen to a lot of little audio snippets to get Zabłocki just right. But so what we want to do in this hour is, I think I want to tell you a little bit about the author and what he brings to this book, as well as the book itself, as a reading experience, both as a general reader and, maybe from the perspective of what I bring with my academic background in Russia. And of course, hopefully leave time for questions. So first, let me give you a 2-minute version of the book. And then, like Russian dolls, those little matryoshki, we'll unpack the book much more deeply. So that's my plan. First of all, has anyone had the opportunity to read the book? Okay, some of you have. Okay, great. And I bet some of you are trying to decide whether you should read it, right? That's partially why you're here. So Witold Zabłocki, a Polish journalist, tracked down and interviewed a number of people to tell the story of the ebb and flow of the power of the Russian state from imperial to current times through the prism of food. And we learn about what the political elite ate from the perspective of the people who cooked and served them, as well as how Soviet citizens also survived catastrophic experiences during the Soviet era, such as the Ukrainian Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, the siege of Leningrad, World War II, the forced migration of Tatars from Crimea to Central Asian republics during Stalin's Russia, the cleanup of Chernobyl. We learn about the USSR's foreign policy triumphs, such as Yalta Conference in 1945, when Stalin was sort of acknowledged as the leader of one of the superpowers and winners in the post-World War II era, as well as advances in the space race. And we also learn about setbacks for the Soviet Union, such as the invasion of Afghanistan. And we learn about how the USSR collapsed spectacularly and rather suddenly in a hunting lodge in the wilds of Belarus in December of 1991. So working mostly chronologically through time, his book is easy and pleasant to read, unfolding in a delightfully chatty manner, but also that deeply captures, I think, the humanism of the people who both survived the Soviet system and in some ways, right, found ways to flourish. So I think it's also a book about humans' enormous resiliency and also survival. So that's the very 2-minute overview. And we'll come back and go through that more deeply. Now, as a reader, I love books that explore history through a very particular prism. So I'm a complete sucker for books, that propose to tell the history of the world through some particular end, whether it's the history of the world through salt, history of the world in 6 glasses, telling about the world through the evolution of forks. One of my favorite books and podcasts is A History of the World in 100 Objects by the former director of the British Museum. It's a wonderful podcast to listen to where he talks about one item that he takes from the museum and then what does that tell us about different eras. However, when I first read this book and started it, I was a little suspicious, right? I thought, Well, I have a PhD in political science. I read serious books. And as someone who is fairly well read in Russian or Soviet history, I do think, right, you're not going to necessarily get a deep dive into understanding the very sort of peculiar workings of, say, Yalta or specifically Chernobyl. But let's enter his world and his framework of food as a way to understanding greater truths about how countries work. Because, right, I think all of us have traveled, right? And I think when we think about it, so much of how we remember a country is through the prism of food, right? When we've been somewhere, what was eaten or not, with whom, where was it? And how often in our travels do we use food as a proxy to make greater judgments or observations about how a country works? So, in that way, this book is perfect. And so, just thinking about my own personal history with the USSR and Russia, I realize how many of my observations that I have made about Russia are based on my experiences with food, and particularly in the Soviet era when everything was grown, produced, distributed, sold, or sometimes not sold by the party state. With food, inevitably, you almost ingest ideology. So I think in some ways, food has an even bigger symbolism and an even greater ability to tell us something about power and how power worked in the Soviet Union. So before I talk about his book, I just wanted to add a little bit about my own experiences, right? About how food taught me something I did not know about Russia or illustrated a greater truth. Here is a slide of just two pictures from Ukraine. As it was noted in my introduction, I actually went to Ukraine as a 6-year-old. I think it was in 1977. My parents were professors. My mom was a history professor. We didn't have a lot of money, so we'd always buy a VW van, pick it up in Berlin, and then just drive around Europe. And since she was a teacher, she thought it would be educational if she applied for a visa, and we would drive our VW Volkswagen van all through the Ukrainian countryside in the summer of 1977. And so I don't remember that much. I was 6, but because it was a VW camper van, we were not staying in kind of the highly urbanized areas that are often sort of the image that you get in sort of Soviet era postcards that portray everything as incredibly beautiful and well working. Rather, we were driving a lot through the countryside, often in areas, the rural areas, which were much less well developed. Often in order to get milk, my mom would have to ask someone to just milk a cow and bring the milk out for me. And even though I probably didn't have this thought when I was 6, I do think that experience, right, looking back, gave me an awareness of the vast differences, not only between the Soviet urbanized areas and the rural ones, but also on kind of the large, vast gap between how the Soviet Union often wanted to portray itself on the world stage, and often how development was so unevenly, right, spread out among not only urban and rural areas, but also between all the republics. Fast forward to 1988, when as a senior in high school, I was taken over to East Berlin. Once again, my parents had a research grant, and the research, the archives that they needed to access were just happened to be in the East Berlin Staatsbibliothek. And so I was the only one that had a visa that could go back and forth across to West Berlin in order to go from high school. So here are some pictures of some of the products, of course, that you could buy in East Berlin. I very particularly remember these chocolate biscuits that were called Othello cakes, because I just thought that was such an odd name that I don't think would fly in the United States or in the kind of PC West, that you would name a chocolate biscuit after a kind of African-based character in a Shakespeare novel. So I always kind of remember Othello cakes in my memory. But I think the important thing about the food is that I crossed the wall, and because I was the only one that could go back and forth, I often brought back products from the West for my parents that could not be purchased in the East in the grocery stores, which all had sufficient food, right? There was plenty of food in East German stores, but only if you liked sea buckthorn juice, right? Which now is actually sold at the co-op for quite a lot of money. But believe me, in the late 1980s, sea buckthorn juice, which I think was shipped in from Poland, was not as desirable as sort of that orange juice that you could buy in the West, for example. And they only had one kind of chocolate cookie, right? That was the only kind of biscuit you could buy if you wanted to have a chocolate cookie. And so I often brought back orange juice for my dad or West German pastries, because in the East, the cherry strudel that he liked, they did not extract the cherry pits from the pastries. And in the West, they did. And of course, I'm also embarrassed to say my middle-aged self looking at my teenage self, when I went to the West, I spent way too much time at the Burger King at the US Army base in West Berlin instead of taking advantage of all of the amazing cultural things to see in West Berlin, although I did see those. But more broadly, what I noticed from that food experience is that while food was plentiful, choice was not in communist East Germany. And all that was available was what the Soviet trading bloc, known as Comecon, could supply. And so I always have wondered since then whether the communist system could have lasted longer if the regime had just figured out how to meet consumer demand a little bit better. Because that is what so many people in some ways cared about, as opposed to esoteric political beliefs. Fast forward to Russia in the 1990s. Okay, something is just popping up from Bonnie saying, have y'all started yet? Not hearing anything and no video yet. So do you want me to problem solve that, or?
Let's pause for a moment.
Okay,
I don't know the solution to that.
okay, all right.
What's the name of the juice again? Say it's.
Oh, I think it's sea buckthorn juice. It was known as sandthorn juice right then. If you go to the co-op now, it's in the little organic section. It's kind of a bright orange. Yeah, but at the time you could buy Polish pickles. You could, of course, but if you didn't want to eat pickles, you were kind of out of luck in the East German grocery store.
That was earlier because we got a slightly late start.
Oh, okay. We're all good? Okay. All right. So fast forward to Russia in 1991, and then we will get back to the book. I'm just thinking about reading the book made me think about what I realized. I was an exchange student in 1992 in the university at St. Petersburg. That's where I met my husband, Doug. And at the time, the Yeltsin administration had just unleashed its transition to capitalism. And what that meant is that subsidies on the price of basic goods had been lifted. Privatization process of selling off state-owned companies had started. And along with that, the ruble was now had to be convertible, right? So it was no longer $1 for 1 ruble, but it was the international market that decided how much the ruble was worth. And of course, every month we went to the exchange place, it was worth less and less, which didn't matter to us as Americans, but which mattered tremendously to Russians who were living off of a fixed income, needing to be able to buy their basic goods. So that semester for us was really a trial by fire. If you look at this image right here, this is the contraction of the Russian economy from about 1989. And you can see that the Russian economy contracts in size year after year after year in 1998. So it was a horrendous, absolutely horrendous decade for any Russian to live through. On top of that, this is a graph that shows inflation rates in the early 1990s. All you need to know is that inflation was over 1,000%. So at a time when the economy is contracting, also all of the money that you have carefully saved in Soviet banks is now worth nothing. And this wasn't just a shortage of food, although it is true there was nothing you could buy in the stores when I was there as a student. We were incredibly lucky, just as American students, to be able to stay alive by what the Stolovaya could feed us by probably purchasing food off the black market. And the other thing I remember about how the Russian economy worked through food in the early 1990s is the old Soviet system of privileges still existed. So if you had dollars, you could go into the special tourist stores and buy all of the things that you needed that everyday average Russian citizens could not buy in their own stores. And this absence of food stood for so much more for Russians. If you look at this graph, this is male life expectancy. Russia, as you'll see in the 1960s, is below many other countries already. Here it is in 1985. Here you can see the economic transition of the 1990s reflected in the literal loss of life. Mostly for Russian men. Women fared a little bit better, in part because they tended to engage in less risky behavior, but I think women had better support networks. And of course, these pictures are just the inevitable line for food that you had to wait for. And then again, the arrival of capitalism. This was the only McDonald's at the time. It was in Moscow. Western college students, we would take the night train to stand in line for several hours to get a glorious McDonald's hamburger. Another thing I'm slightly embarrassed about.
Just those red inflation, can you put some dates on the big
Oh yeah,
and the little bump?
right. So that is, I'm going to guess. So this are the early 1990s. So this is 92, and I'm going to guess that this is 1998. Which is when the Russian economy collapsed again. But I think the larger thing is what all of us who did study abroad in 1999 or 1991 remember was the food situation and what that told us about the true horrors if you were a Russian trying to actually manage that incredibly difficult transition. And when I returned to Russia in 1998, once again, I saw a very different world than the one in 1992. For one, you sort of saw this kind of surface Westernization in the major urban areas. That's why I have kind of Russian Vogue there. You could also sort of see all the major Western chains. The Russian economy by 1998 at the beginning of the year was stable enough that they had issued new currency. The old Russian rubles were 50,000 rubles. For many people who grew up in the Soviet system, 50,000 rubles used to be something you could buy a car with. Now you could only buy like a bag of, frozen vegetables with. So they issued new currency right when I was getting there, just lopping off 3 zeros from the old currency, right? So that the new currency would kind of be accepted by Russians and trying to normalize the Russian economy. But the larger takeaway from 1998, when I think through the prism of food, was that through food as a student living there, you could see that there was a small middle class emerging in the late 1990s, right? That there was the concept of takeaway food, which was an indication of a middle class, which actually had disposable income, right? Which could then spend it. The grocery stores had much more products. It seemed like Russia had turned a corner. But of course, it did not. The Russian government defaulted on its debt. Here is a sign, a picture of a line of people standing in line, desperately trying to get their money out of the banks. And then, of course, when I think about Russia under Putin, it is a time of economic resurgence. So this here is a graph of the Russian economy growing and growing steadily every single year until it finally takes a dip in about 2008 with the financial crisis and continues to grow. And you continue to see that trickle down of wealth and the food choices that Russians made. First, you see a turn to kind of Russian nationalism, right? With just the growth of Russian chains, right? Not McDonald's or Subway or Burger Queen, but Russian chains of food Ruskaya Bistro was one of the biggest ones when I was there. And also what you kind of ironically have is a real nostalgia for Soviet era cooking. So enough time has gone by in which for a lot of the young, trendy Russians, the most amazing thing that you can do is to go to a really expensive restaurant in Moscow, which in some way replicates the Soviet dining experience, right? So here's Stolovaya number 57. That's in GUM, the big expensive shopping market in Moscow. Here you have a Russian restaurant, which is made to look like a Soviet era apartment. And this is actually a Russian restaurant, which kind of serves more Russian imperial food. But I think the larger point, when I think about my own experiences, I think about all the memories that I have around food and the things that I've been able to observe about the culture, all the way from the despair of the collapse of the Soviet Union to now a restored surge of pride and nationalism. And of course, finally, I want to acknowledge, as a tourist, I was mostly eating in restaurants, but sometimes I would have the privilege of being hosted in people's homes or included in a group outing. And I can still recall a memorable trip to the forest on Sakhalin Island, walking with a group of Russians. We stopped, and out of nowhere, a roaring fire was built. People pulled out stashes of shashlik, meat cut up out of, places I didn't even know where they had hidden it, chopped vegetables. And we had a tremendous banquet and feast right out in the middle of the forest. I can certainly think of how many times I've been invited to people's homes and had the generosity of the food that they prepared for me around their small kitchen table. And so what all of that has told me is, despite the stereotype of Russians as practically born at the yoke, genetically predisposed to obey the state, Russians, as are people from many cultures, enormously resilient and creative, able to forge survival strategies and flourish through maintaining personal connection at a time when, and I have to take solace in that, in a time when right now Russia is completely ostracized. Anyway, that's all about how a book I first thought might be a little bit silly taught me to think more deeply about how we store memories, often around food, and what food in turn can tell us about cultures. Now let's turn to the book and the man who wrote it. Oh, what's this image? This is just an image of all of the companies that have pulled out of Russia in the wake of Ukraine. And people might want to talk about this in question and answer. A lot of it are food companies, but a lot of Western companies. And so when I think about the sanctions, I think about how in many ways this pulling out of companies is symbolic. And you can find the whole list on the Yale School of Business Management, I think. That for a lot of Russian citizens, this is kind of the death of the idea of Russia as a Western country for a long time, because now the Russian state is pivoting to China and other allies to the east. And I think that's a relationship that might work for the Russian state, but may not have as many opportunities for the citizens. But we can talk about that. Okay, so first of all, who is Witold Zabłocki? So I did a little bit of research. In addition to reading the book, What's Cooking at the Kremlin is his most recent book. But he is a Polish journalist. And I think one of the benefits about reading anything, not just by a Pole, but by an Eastern European journalist, is I don't know if anyone has read any other East European authors, but they have a certain kind of style of writing and a certain way of observing the world, which is kind of a Black humor in a way that doesn't exist in the United States. So I think one of the values of the book, just in general, is to kind of get a little bit of this East European sensibility about how to talk about things, and in many ways to try to find the humor in what are on the surface incredibly tragic circumstances. So hats off to his interpreter, translator, Antonia Lloyd-Jones, who was also able to convey this. But I think also his background is interesting in its own right. He was born in 1980. So for those of you who know something about Eastern European politics. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. In Poland, 1980 was the year that the kind of Solidarity Trade Union had its big sort of uprising and organization. And so this is all by way of saying he kind of spent his childhood in the waning days of Soviet Poland. He went to university to study political science and journalism. And then after that, relocated to Turkey, both to do some graduate work and also to work for CNN as a journalist. And so he was coming of age at a time in which Poland was very clearly choosing to look west. I think it probably joined NATO maybe in 1999, and it joined the European Union along with a bunch of other East European countries in 2004. So he kind of came of age at this time of, I think, in one way, enormous stress. I think it's very stressful, hoping that you're going to be successful in this new world, but also of age in which Poland was very clearly choosing a different direction. While he was a journalist in Turkey, this was what his first book was about, The Assassin from Apricot City. His reporting, he was the first Western reporter to talk to the family of the Turkish would-be assassin of the Polish Pope. I don't know if people remember that event. He also was an award-winning journalist that was recognized for his work on honor killings in Turkey. But then when he returned from Turkey to take a job as a young but kind of really wonderkind journalist in Poland, he turned his attention to his next book called Dancing Bears, True Stories of People Nostalgic for Life Under Tyranny, where he kind of traveled around Eastern Europe to try to understand people's lived experiences of capitalism and their nostalgia for, in many ways, a kind of fictional Soviet past. And he kind of used the idea of these dancing bears as, in some ways, an allegory or symbolism for these citizens trying to navigate this new world. The book that came out before What's Cooking at the Kremlin was a book called How to Feed a Dictator, Saddam Hussein, Idi Amin, Enver Hoxha, Fidel Castro, and Pol Pot through the eyes of their cooks. So this kind of got him interested. And in many ways, right, you want to know something about somebody, you can learn a lot about what they eat, right, and kind of how they interact with food. I just finished that one. It was also a great read. And so more broadly across all of his work, so those are his main books that have been translated into English. There's one I really want to read that's just available in Polish. When in 2012, after a trip to Cuba, he and his wife came back to Poland and wanted to live for a year as if they were living in communist Poland. So they would only wear kind of communist era clothing, eat kind of food that was available during the communist era. So I don't know what they uncovered in the book that they wrote because it's only available in Polish, but it's the type of thing that I, of course, would love to read. But across all of his work, you get a sense of his style. One, he has an incredible ability to talk to almost anyone and to get almost anyone to talk to him and develop a rapport almost immediately. So this was one of the fun things about reading the book is you're just like, I can't believe this person is like spilling the beans to him. Like, how did he do that? And as he said in an interview, he never tries to justify his subjects, but he does try to understand them. And in an interview, he says, even when I'm writing something that is very sad, I try to let a little light in, which is perhaps why one reviewer noted that his material is easy and pleasant to read, but if you read more closely, is incredibly profound. So What's Cooking in the Kremlin it's part of a life's work devoted to getting into a society through the cracks provided by culture, using that to widen the crack until something larger can be excavated about that. And so what can be excavated about what's cooking in the Kremlin? So rather than just kind of going through and being like, chapter 1 was about blah, 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 chapter 2 was about blah, 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 I'm going to kind of go through the 18 chapters and maybe highlight some of the little nuggets of wisdom that he was able to pull out of people before I talk more broadly about what I thought was most enjoyable about the book. So I think some of the insights that he gave me is in his chapters about Tsarist Russia. He talked about the last days of the imperial family before they were shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg. And some of the nuggets that came through in food as he published some of the recipes that the royal family was eating during World War I, when the Russian army was being absolutely pummeled and soldiers were dying by the thousands. And so when Russia was taking a beating in World War I, the Tsar ate lunches of pâtés, pork goulash, crab pilaf, poulard stuffed with snipe and peaches. So enormous sort of wealth and a complete lack of an awareness of what soldiers at the front might be eating. And in fact, one of his favorite dishes was pasta with turtle doves. And I read the recipe at the end of the chapter. And according to the recipe, the doves had to be lured by hand and strangled so the Tsar would not find pellets and be so inconvenienced to have to eat them. At the same time, we learn that the day before they were all killed in the basement, the Communist Party, kind of local party elite, ordered 50 eggs from the local convent where they got their eggs. Those eggs were not for the royal family, but to reward the peasants who participated in the assassination and the burial of the bodies. So again, you sort of have these little stories which really kind of illustrate something sort of deeply sad and profound about what all Russians had to suffer through. We then learn about some of the eating preferences about the early Soviet leaders. We learn that in particular Lenin, but I think we can also probably say Brezhnev and Khrushchev, both were relatively simple eaters. Lenin's favorite dish was scrambled eggs. Although he called it something else, but when I read the recipe, it's scrambled eggs. Or simple dishes like kasha, a simple kind of grain with vegetables. But at the same time, even though he was a relatively simple eater, they had hired help to cook for him something which he did not want Soviet citizens to know, because it was an indication that already the Soviet elite were living a more privileged life than the one that they claimed to represent. We then go on to learn a little bit about Stalin and how he used the sort of drunken party, the massive toasts, the Georgian food, the huge spread to intimidate political rivals, and also literally incapacitate them at the drinking table as a power maneuver, right, in his own quest to climb the ranks of Soviet power. And we also learn that Khrushchev, I couldn't get a picture of him holding a shot glass, but that he had shot glasses specially made that were made to look as large as a normal shot glass, but really held much less of the regular liquid, in a way as a survival strategy for himself at these kind of power elite meetings. But I thought it was also an interesting also comparison to kind of the whole Soviet project, which was always about trying to look larger and bigger, right, than you really were. So those were just some little nuggets. As he moved through time, he also covered chapters on how food was an expression of power. These are all pictures. Again, I couldn't get great ones, but they all, I think, try to illustrate the idea that the Russian state used food very specifically at banquets, in having very elaborate food displays, giant piles of black caviar, right, is a way to illustrate Soviet power and strength, right? That the Soviet system could, in fact, right, provide more, feed better, do it more kind of successfully than the West could. And so there are entire chapters devoted to how this was a very deliberate strategy of foreign policy, and how that didn't really change, we'll get to, until we get to Gorbachev. And we see how even in the space race, there's a chapter about the launching of Yuri Gagarin, the first man to orbit the Earth, and just the development of Soviet food technology, and the enormous pride that Soviet workers felt in being world leaders and trying to figure out how to make borscht, how to make shi, how to make someone's favorite apple recipe and turn it into a little pate that can then be shipped up into the space station. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they had the space station Mir as a way to build friendship with other cultures, one of the things that the workers would do, who were the food technologists, was try to find out the national foods of the cultures that were being hosted in Mir so that they could make their own specific food products for them. And I'll come back to kind of what I thought was so significant about that you have all of these kind of just touches of humanity throughout the Soviet system of citizens, in many ways, just trying to do the best job that they can. You find a lot of insights of survival from instances of severe food deprivation. So I did not put pictures up of Ukrainian famine survivors. So I just have a map instead of the death toll of Stalin's induced famine in the effort to get Ukraine to collectivize its farms. They also cover the blockade of Leningrad, when essentially the Germans blockaded the city for over 900 days and citizens were stuck there with absolutely nothing to eat. And so those chapters tell us incredible stories, not just of survival and resilience, but also of random acts of kindness, of people who recall surviving because their school teacher happened to slip them a beet on the side, or an uncle happened to be able to try to get someone a job in a factory, or somebody slipped someone a tip that, hey, go to the store and get that last jar of caviar. It's going to keep you alive. And so I think the amazing things about the chapters that cover the lack of food is the ways in which people remember these small acts of kindness being the one small thing that randomly kept them alive as opposed to dead. And I think those are some of the most moving chapters. And in fact, in the blockade of Leningrad, one of the survivors, it wasn't so much about food, but he talked about the women, one of their jobs was to go to the rooftops when Leningrad would be bombed and by hand sweep the bombs off the roof, right, to kind of keep the buildings catching on fire, and women going about this, right, as this was their wartime job. Or the person who remembers their teacher continuing to teach geography from the bowels of a metro station during a bombing raid. So those insights of survival were incredibly moving about what people were still able and willing to do. Other things we learned are that connections matter, whether you're in the elite. So we learned a little bit about what it takes to become a Soviet chef and how being a chef to the elite had its perks. And this gets to kind of the two-tier Soviet system that I talked about even when I was there in 1992. If you worked for the Kremlin, you only had to wait 2 years for a Soviet car, for example, or you were given access to a handmade suit once a year by the Kremlin tailor. And as I was referencing before, this is a picture of a piece of a replica of the bread that they were able to make in Leningrad during the blockade, made out of sawdust, glue, and other items, right, that whatever people could cobble together to try to survive. And so again, so many stories of survival based on some connection. We also learn a lot about leader preferences. You know, what did they like to eat and not eat? So a lot of Soviet leaders were, right, as communists, relatively plain in their preferences. Everyone hated, according to the book, cooking for Gorbachev, because as a leader, he was trying to reform the Soviet Union. He was trying to cut back on the lavish banquets, which allowed chefs to show off the skills that they had learned in Soviet school. He also himself was just kind of an abstemious person, right? Wanted kind of low calorie, low fat food, also encouraged by his wife, Raiza. But we also learn that Margaret Thatcher apparently really liked blinis, and that on one of her early trips to meet with Gorbachev, the Kremlin chef, he actually didn't make the blinis with the caviar, I think it was more like pancakes. So it probably came with jam or varenya or some kind of fruit thing. But just this fact, right, that she had this like great breakfast and she loved the blinis and she apparently asked for 3 plates, according to this chef. It's sort of this like minor story behind what became a famous friendship between Gorbachev, Reagan, and Thatcher. And we also learn how the Soviet Union ended, which was a treaty at a hunting lodge to hunt boar in the wilds of Belarus, where 3 leaders, that's what that picture is there, are meeting, and how most people that came to that hunting lodge were not aware that they were coming to actually sign a treaty to essentially bring about the dissolution of the USSR. And they did that by Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia all agreeing to secede from the USSR. When those 3 republics secede, there's nothing left. And so one of the memories of one of the people that were cooking for that said, the next day, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, dismembered our country just like that boar. So in people's recollection that were involved in this treaty, it was not all public and above board, but rather kind of beyond the scenes. And finally, and I would probably say the least satisfying part of the book, through no fault of his own, were the final few chapters, which tried to cover the Putin administration. So there was a little bit about this person, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was known as Putin's chef for his role in procuring food for a while. And a caterer for Putin, and then a little bit about kind of his grandfather supposedly maybe being a cook for Stalin. But I think the interesting things is that there wasn't a lot of content in those chapters because in many ways, the Putin administration is a big mystery itself, right? In terms of our access to people who actually have worked for Putin living in Russia and what they can or can't tell us. So I thought that was an interesting, in some ways, reflection of reality. So in closing, what do I think are the big takeaways from the book, beyond the book itself, the specifics? I think if you like oral histories, and I want to make a plea for oral histories, I think they are so important. Not necessarily because people's memories or narratives are true, but it's that it's our last chance, right, to hear from someone who lived through this experience and to hear their lived experience of what it was like. And when those people die, if nobody records their thoughts, then it's gone. And so I think there was enormous value. And in fact, since the book was published, several of the people he talked to, some of the survivors of the Ukrainian famine or even St. Petersburg, died in between the publication of the book. And so if you don't take down their memories, then those memories almost are gone, although they live somewhere else. We just can't always access them. I think the second big takeaway that I took away is, I know this isn't phrased very elegantly, but that Soviets were human, right? And they had dreams. So there were so many people that he interviewed, right, who say, for example, worked for the Soviet space station, right? Or we have a whole chapter about the women who selflessly worked in the canteens and the Chernobyl cleanup, right? They were all there, right? Just trying to do their jobs to the best of their abilities. Many of them actually, if not believed in the Soviet system, right, believed in trying to make their country a better place. Something which I think is almost hard to hang on to since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when kind of the split in wealth and kind of the acquisition of the oligarchs became kind of almost obscene. So there was something touching about reading these people talking about how they were just trying to help the system work on a day-to-day basis. I think I talked about this, but I think humans' capacity for survival and their ability to practice small acts of kindness, it's what keeps us all human. And I think the number of people that were able to remain human in often inhuman circumstances was one of the most moving parts of the book. And I think the last thing I would say are that women are often kind of the unsung heroes. Certainly men did really important things in the Soviet Union, particularly in terms of having to go off and fight the war. But so many of the women were the ones who stayed behind and tried to hold together their families, continue their legacies, and provide a reason not just for them to live, but for their children to keep going on in everyday acts of resilience. And so those were the things I took away. And of course, the many wonderful recipes at the end of each chapter of fabulous Russian food. Okay, I'll stop there. And anybody who has questions, and I'm happy to stay later, I'm happy to take them. Thank you. Yeah.
It seems like a strange question. I almost didn't raise my hand. I really like the way you humanize the book and the people involved, and especially your background, because you know so much about it. And it makes me curious in today's situation, if you think the Soviet people are proud of being Russian. Do they feel that patriotism about it?
Absolutely. So first, I think there's both nostalgia, but also a real sense of loss at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if you go to Levada.org, the Levada Center is the last kind of sort of public opinion polling station that Westerners read and follow. But yeah, there's an enormous number of people who really, they don't necessarily want to go back to the communist era, but they really regret the collapse of their country, the fact that it is no longer a power, the fact that it is geographically much smaller. And so I think today you'll see that Vladimir Putin's approval ratings are still really high. And part of that, of course, is that I'm sure there are enormous disincentives, right? I think people are probably afraid to say what they really think. But I think like citizens in many countries, right, they support their state and whatever their state is trying to achieve. And so I think in that sense, and I'm just going to go on to political science, I think policymakers really need to think about, we don't want to alienate the Russian people, right? We want to isolate what we don't like about what the Russian state is doing. But I think we can't demonize people for supporting their state and loving their country. And I think also, if we want to think to a Russia after Putin someday, the idea that the Russian people are incredibly resilient, brave, imaginative people, I think also is really important. So that's more than what you asked, but I just kind of wanted to keep going.
I was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wanted to add, you had that picture of Putin with his chef, and that was the guy that went on to lead the Wagner Force.
Yes. Yeah. That was Prigozhin. Yeah. So his nickname was Putin Chef, and then later on, that grew into him being a fixer. And yes, as if those of you don't know, he eventually was shot down in a plane with some of his other inner elite in retaliation for leading an armed march up to Moscow. But yeah, that's also why I think there's just not a lot in the book about the Putin regime, because the punishment for disloyalty and perceived disloyalty is huge. Yeah, Jim.
Can you say anything about the economy now? I read his article in New York Times 3 or 4 days ago about all of a sudden they're really getting stressed by some of the financial constraints or oil and revenue, et cetera.
Yeah, and this doesn't exactly get to it. So the Russian economy. So I think you're probably all reading a lot of really contradictory stories because it's hard to make sense of. On the one hand, I think the Russian economy is doing much better than I think anyone who operated in the sanctions regime and imposing it was hoping. So, its growth has been, its projected growth by the IMF and the World Bank has been upped to, I think, something about between 2 and 3%. A lot of that is because of its oil and natural gas revenues. It's also been able to pivot to countries that are not participating in the sanctions. Also, because it's operating under a war economy, it is full employment. So everybody's working. And the last thing I would say is that even if the The Kremlin is kind of run by security services. I would say his economic portfolio is run by really competent, what we call technocrats, right? People who went to graduate school in econ that have worked very hard to keep the Russian economy growing. So on the one hand, it's doing well in that it is growing way beyond we expected. On the other hand, there are all of these economic problems that I think the West is hoping are going to catch up with Russia. So one is that by running a war economy, the state has stepped in as the employer and put a lot of money into the economy. So one of the dangers with that is that it's going to feed inflation. So that's one challenge right there, is that by being the big employer now, you're in many ways just kind of cycling inflation. And then what the economic portfolio people have to do is try to raise interest rates. So that's one danger of the economy overheating. The other danger, I think, is that Russia is already operating under full employment. It's doing everything it can to try to send whatever man it can find out to the front. So it actually needs more bodies to keep its wartime economy going. So that's a problem. And then I think the third problem is, in order to keep the war going, it's taking an enormous amount of resources that you're not spending on roads and pensions and education. And so the Russian state, in its effort to keep sending people to the front, are offering all-time high payouts to get people to go, really high payouts for soldiers who die, because it doesn't want to take ethnic Russians from the major cities where that could create protests. They're pulling from poor ethnic regions and far-flung areas across Russia. So in that sense, there are all these kind of, it's the sense of like there are these problems boiling, but they haven't boiled over yet. And I would probably say a pretty competent economic ministry has been helping that from boiling over. So, you know, I think the sanctions are certainly punishing the regime, but I don't think they're going to. And this is kind of in general always the debate about sanctions. They don't necessarily change behavior, but they do extract a cost.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Oh, and so I had put this up here just in case we had time, sort of the political science perspective on food, why food matters. Ukraine and Russia are both two of the largest producers and suppliers of wheat, which the developing world needs. Russia is making a lot more money right now out of exporting wheat because Ukraine has had such a difficult time trying to both get its wheat out of its harbors as well as grow its wheat in war zones. And so a lot of the Russian strategy to demoralize Ukraine once again revolves around food, trying to prevent Ukrainians' ability to be able to grow food by distributing enormous numbers of landmines, right, in order to kind of like physically destroy the land. And also by depriving countries that are reliant on that wheat a lot in the developing world. So these are the biggest importers of Russian and Ukrainian wheat. You know, you'll see this is a map of all the countries not participating in the sanctions. And so all these countries in gray, right, a lot of them just want the war to be over. They don't care necessarily who wins. And so you see Russia using food very much as a war tool because it wants to win. And one way it can do that is by using food as a weapon, both in Ukraine as well as the countries dependent on that wheat. Yeah.
The recent large devaluation of the ruble is going to cause Russia to have to pay a higher price for things they import, right?
Right. And so, yes, when you devalue things, that means it's great for us as tourists, although I think most of us probably could not get visas, but it makes it really hard for anything that Russia has to import. One of the difficulties is that, you know, one of the things that Russia has been working on is needing to import fewer things. So it is going to incur a cost on them. But also part of their longer term strategy is to, not need to import as much. Another thing that Russia has done over the years is it's built two very large, what are called stability funds, where anytime they make more than a certain amount of money per barrel of oil or natural gas, they put it in the stability fund so that they can use that money in times of crisis. So they're using that money now, they're running it down. But one of the things that Putin did in his first term is he paid down almost all of Russia's foreign debt because he recognized that Russia was not going to be able to be an independent actor if it was heavily indebted to other countries. So yeah, it's like we're always on the horizon thinking, right? This is the year that the economic costs of Russia's war are really going to come back and bite the Putin administration. But one of the things I fear, right, is as someone who condemns the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is that like there's not enough leverage, right, to kind of get Putin out of office. Like, it's almost impossible to impeach a president. He just got reelected. He has 6 more years. United Russia is the dominant party in the legislature. So I think one thing that policymakers have to think of too is like, how do you pressure a regime where the domestic population can't really exercise much pressure? And again, I don't know if people know how impossible it would be for Russians to protest. They're not allowed to call what's happening a war. They're not allowed to say anything about the real status of the war, because then you're releasing disinformation about the Russian armed services. You can go to prison, right? I'm working with a grad student right now who's here on a Fulbright grant that doesn't want to return to Russia because by returning, she's labeled a foreign agent because she took a grant to study in the United States. So I think one of the things that's really hard is there's almost no room for civil society to maneuver. And most people just want to, they want to stay alive. They don't want to go to jail. They don't want to lose their job. And so now Putin is the age of average male life expectancy right now. So a lot of people are kind of wondering, like, what would happen if he died in office? Like, what might that mean? And according to the Constitution, the prime minister would be next. The prime minister is a technocrat, right? He's just head of the tax authority, right? His probably main concern is keeping the economy running, but whether the Security Council, who is not next in line by the Constitution, whether they would allow the prime minister to assume the presidency would be a big question, so. But I think what's really hard is we really don't know what Russians think, except that like most citizens of countries, they tend to support whatever, campaign their state is engaged in. Yeah.
The people that have access to the internet in Russia, can they learn from information out in the outside?
So you have to have access to VPN. Where you can't just go on in Russia. Like say, for example, like you don't have access to Facebook or any of that. And so VPN.
International news, can they go?
So a lot of the international news that have offices in Russia have been declared as undesirable agents by the state, which gives the state the power to shut them down. So what a lot of Russian citizens who want to try to read news, because BBC can't actually operate within Russia anymore. That's where you need this thing called a VPN. What does VPN stand for? Virtual private network. So that allows you to kind of access web pages where you can't necessarily be tracked by the state. Because one of the things is Roskomnadzor, which is the kind of internet agency, the state agency, they have enormous kind of authority to be able to track what people do on the internet. So you can even be arrested for posting something on the internet on VKontakte, the Russian version of kind of Facebook, because you can't use Facebook, you can be arrested for that, right? Writing something that is seen as disloyal. So I think,
Any prediction, Trump's policies?
yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know if people saw the editorial that JD Vance wrote when he was a vice presidential candidate, which was advocating to stop funding Ukraine. And his argument was that Ukraine cannot win this war by winning. I think he meant probably regaining territory. So certainly the vice president's position, which I don't think has changed, is no more aid to Ukraine. Now, whether he can will that or not, or kind of get Congress to go along with that, we don't know. But that probably is why you might see the Biden administration doing everything it can now. Trump, I think, is a real dark horse. Like, I don't know if anyone saw the debate with Kamala Harris, and I don't think he has the ability to bring peace in 24 hours. You know, I think that was one thing he said. And I don't think that's true. My only fear, I think, with Trump is he has such a tendency for bilateral relations. And I think a real challenge is trying to think of multiple players. You know, I think his strategy is that he's going to potentially try to yank funding from Ukraine in an effort to kind of push and incentivize negotiation. So that would probably be my fear, that I don't think he has the approach that there are different ways that Ukraine can win, and one way that it can negotiate a peace is by raising the costs for Russia to stay there. And I don't think he has that kind of approach. So that's what makes me very nervous. But I do know Ukrainians themselves are much more supportive of some kind of ceasefire, which is inevitably going to, I think, involve giving up land that Russia currently occupies. Because if the Russian army is occupying it, I think it will be realistically difficult to dislodge them. So I think the big challenge now will be, in some ways, are Ukrainians willing to give up land? But what Western countries will need to think about is what kind of security guarantee they're willing to offer. That's something Western countries can do. And I'm also concerned whether the Trump administration is willing to commit to that. You know, that will be something
Yeah.
to watch. Yeah.
Last
So-
question, I think.
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to stick around if anyone has questions.
Short, what do you think Putin thinks he's can get from Ukraine? Because since he's destroyed so many cities, and if he can get extra land, is that the?
You know, I used to always teach Putin as like a rational actor. You know, that ultimately he started off his presidential administration with a pro-Western policy, thought Russia would be better off with its national security objectives on the side of the West than against it. That gradually fell away, partially in reaction to some Western moves. But still, the analysis was always that, you know, Putin is not a risk taker. You know, he wants to modernize Russia. So he would never invade Ukraine. It's like completely irrational. It's expensive. It's deadly, all these things. So this is all by way of saying, when I actually watched his speech, both announcing the invasion of Ukraine and read his article, like on the historical unity, I don't want to call it, dismiss it as irrational, but it was so much bigger than like complaints about like how NATO went down, that I really, for the first time, thought, oh, like we're in trouble, because he is wedded to a narrative, right, in which the only way Russia can win, right, in many ways, is to kind of just keep going. And so that was what was scariest to me, because I really can't see anything that Russia would really be willing to negotiate on with the team that's in place, right? Given his worldview. And I think because he's become so much more isolated over the years of being president for now almost 25 years, it's his world has grown so much smaller in terms of the people who are allowed to give him feedback, give him unpleasant truths. And so in that sense, he's so much more wedded to his worldview. And that's, I think, what scares me. Like, you're not going to be able to, well, Putin, but did you think about, so he's not interested in that. And I think that's what scares me. Like, we've just crossed that bridge. And I don't know if anyone's read Dmitry Medvedev, who was for a while the kinder, gentler president from 2008 to 2012. He has a really scary Twitter account as well that's just full of like super venomous Russian nationalism. So yeah,
Two quickies.
yeah.
Wasn't Kiev the original capital of Russia? I mean, before,
Right.
secondly, what is the Russian Orthodox Church? Does that play any role in?
Yeah, well, it's in alignment with the Putin administration. So they have the same version of history. I mean, I would almost give a very slight comparison to just trying to rewrite US history and how for some groups in the United States, it's incredibly ugly and sort of upsetting to even think about rewriting the glory of the founding fathers to like integrate slavery and unpleasant things. So we of all countries should be familiar with the idea of people being really wedded to a history. Now, getting to kind of the history, so I think of history as narratives, right? The stories that we like to tell about how we understand ourselves. And so in that sense, I would say the story that Russia likes to tell itself is that there was something called Kievan Rus, right, which was founded in the 800s. And that evolved, right, as a political center. But then at some point, right, in the 1200s, the Mongols invade and sack all of that. And at some point, several hundred years later, a kind of political center emerges in Novgorod and Moscow. And so they trace their legacy back to this idea of Kievan Rus. But that's a little bit different than sort of saying that there was this continuous Russian state that existed. It's that there was something called Kievan Rus where Slavic cultures lived for several hundred years. Then you have this period of enormous political dislocation. You have a reemergence of the state in a geographically different part of still Slavic peoples. And it used to be that kind of Ukrainians and Russians told the same narrative that you could trace it back to 800. But now, thanks to the war, Ukrainians are much more interested in a different narrative that says Kievan Rus was really the evolution of Ukraine, and Russia didn't really evolve until like Novgorod and Moscow later. And for me, this was new because I sort of grew up with the Russian narrative, you know, like I used to teach, like Russia can trace its historical roots back to the 800s. And then with the war, I read a lot more kind of Ukrainian historians, and certainly they tell the story differently. And I think it's worth reading that narrative just to get a sense of the same event is now told very differently by two different countries. So Tim Snyder has a really good YouTube and a podcast of the history of Ukraine you can listen to for free, which was just informative to me because I came at Ukraine as a Russia specialist. So it was my first opportunity of maybe learning about Ukraine from a Ukrainian specialist, and it was worthwhile. Okay, if anybody has any more questions, I'm still here. So, but thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.